What about spiritual causes? Ayurveda can be used to analyze the nature of your spiritual practices. So when a person is ungrounded, spacey, or easily influenced, or has trouble setting boundaries, right away you're going to be suspicious with your clients that subtle quality is increased or aggravated. One of the primary ways of reducing subtleness is through reevaluating one's spiritual practice. So I want to talk about that and kind of map out what spiritual practices are subtle and can lead to ungroundedness, that can lead to spaciness, that can make you easily persuaded or easily influenced, or make it difficult for you to set boundaries. So some spiritual practices and worldviews are very ungrounding, and that makes it difficult to establish that strong conviction, or makes it difficult to stand your ground, or even to speak with confidence. So if you have an excess of subtle quality in your personality, then you may consider reducing some of these more subtle spiritual practices and beliefs. So one of the most famous practices, one of the most famous spiritual debates that goes back thousands of years is this question: are we all one, or are we all individuals? Right? We hear that in some spiritual belief systems, that we are all one. And in other people will really emphasize, oh, we're all individuals, we're all unique. Well, those both can't be true at the same time, or if they are, we have a tendency sometimes to emphasize one or the other. So this question of subtle quality can be a question of metaphysics and the nature of reality, like, are we all one, or are we all individuals? And monism is any philosophy that says all is one. And what are some characteristics of monism where all is one? So monism itself is a theory or doctrine that it denies the existence of a distinction or duality, perhaps the distinction between matter and the mind, or God and the world. And people who are monists tend to have these kinds of personalities, right? And you may not know that you're monist, but you may be monist nonetheless. So let's think about that. People who are monists tend to think of that everything is made up of energy. All is energy. That there's this universal ground field of energy, and that there's this universal prana that is pervasive, flowing through all things. That all is spirit, right? You've heard folks say that all is spirit. Ultimately, everything equivalent to everything else. That God has no form or attribute, or nirguna. God is nirguna. You hear there's a number of philosophies that say God has no attributes, God has no form, God is everything, is another way of saying that. This is a kind of cosmic consciousness there. And science occasionally expresses this viewpoint as well. The science will sometimes say, oh, atoms are the material behind all form. That's not really a chair that you're looking at, but a collection of atoms. And this equation discovered by Einstein, E equals mc squared. Energy is equivalent to matter times the speed of light squared. Makes everything equal. Makes matter and energy. There's this vast matter and energy field. So that's very interesting. Science sometimes does that. But science is also sometimes very much the opposite. It can also be reductionist, seeing difference in everything. Right? So holistic versus reductionist, right, is a kind of field in which this philosophical question comes up. Altogether, this viewpoint that this idea that all is an energy, everything is equivalent to everything else, is really expresses something very etheric, and that's why it aggravates subtle quality in Ayurveda. And when the person has this point of view to excess, now naturally we want to see commonality between things too, and we'll talk about that. But if a person has this to excess, they see like everything's the same, right? They become a little detached and kind of a little bit indifferent. Their job, for example, may lose their meaning, or their relationship may lose their meaning. All is one, right? We should love everyone equally, or family can seem meaningless. And so a person who has this way of life to excess ends up leading a life of searching instead of one of commitment to anything in particular. Because all is equal, it's hard to commit to something in particular. And I would say this worldview unplugs the root chakra and can erase the passions. So the opposite of this all is one mentality is cherishing the individual, a particular individual, not just any individual. So G.K. Chesterton talks about this issue of are we all one or are we all individuals by comparing it to a potter working with clay to make a statue. And then we have to ask the question, in your life, in your spiritual life, is it more important to you that the statue is made of clay or that the statue has been shaped into a bust of Napoleon? Here we see, it's actually not a clay statue of Napoleon here, but imagine it was. We see that there's this bust of Napoleon on one side or this clay on the other side. Is it more important that Napoleon is made of clay or that the clay has been shaped into a bust of Napoleon? Is it more meaningful to you that I'm John Immel or that I'm a collection of atoms? So a person with excess subtle quality tends to gravitate towards seeing the collection of atoms or seeing the clay. And a person with insufficient subtle quality tends to only see differences. They can't see our commonality, right? And we've seen this work out in social justice issues where in racism and other issues like that, where people I see differences that may not exist. And so we all have to be careful about this issue. Are we all one or are we all individuals? In community, we often need to acknowledge commonality. We need to search for commonality, brotherhood and sisterhood. We need to acknowledge that our actions have global consequences, that we have responsibilities. But the assertion that differences don't exist at all is equally dangerous, right? In excess, the all is one mentality erases individuality and makes everything the same. And it takes away the face of the individual, right? Everyone has a unique face. Our faces are not the same. And so people are not interchangeable. You can't just, break up with your girlfriend or boyfriend and replace them. That's not possible. But a person who has this all is one mentality may think that way to excess. And so oftentimes the all is one mentality can lead to indifference to individual suffering. But so can the other way, right? If a person sees differences between things, they might say, oh, well, that person's so unlike me, I don't care about them, right? So the antidote to a person who has an excess of this all is one mentality, the antidote is cherishing a face, adoring a face, perhaps of someone they love. Cherishing is a practice of attachment. So if you have a practice of detachment, and you have excess subtle quality, you can switch that practice around and start a practice of cherishing, which is the practice of attachment. Cherish something in particular, your hometown, or for example. So by cherishing, you reestablish the ability to commit, and that creates stable quality and creates a strong root. Right? This question of whether we are all one is a very cosmic. We kind of think in the cosmic level. So this question of whether we are all individuals or whether we are all one can be paraphrased by some of these thoughts. Where do you see God as being more present? Is God more present here in the cosmos, or is God more present here in this photo of Bambi? I have a photo of Bambi on the screen here. And where do you see God as being more present, right? In the cute little Bambi or in the majestic cosmos? Now, God is obviously present in both of these places. But where do you tend to focus your energy? How about this question? Do you focus, or should I, let me say this in the first person. Should I focus on all of humanity or my wife? Well, obviously I need to have a focus on all of humanity and my wife, but where am I putting the emphasis? Am I putting the emphasis on universal love, or am I putting the emphasis on personal love? So this idea of think global, act local may be a way of mediating between two of these issues, right? We want to think globally, but act locally, right? I want to love my wife and recognize that my local actions, that my actions that are focused locally and personally affect the world, right? That what I do locally affects people globally. And so that kind of puts us in this perspective that is grounded on both sides of that equation, right? Another question that brings up this issue of the cosmos or the person. Is God mere consciousness, or does God have a body? So, and where are you along that spectrum? Do you think God is only consciousness, or do you think God has a body? So in monism, this idea that all is one, God is consciousness and awareness, but has no form at all. If you look at Judeo and Muslim beliefs, God has a form and an attribute and a quality, right? God has a certain personality, but God is universal and doesn't have a body in the Jewish and Muslim faiths. If you look at the Christian faiths, God has a body, right? God became incarnated in the form of Jesus Christ in the Christian worldview. So God is corporal, but also universal at the same time, because Christians have the God of the Jews, but also has the incarnation of Christ. And so there's this idea that God has a bodily form and also a universal form. And then there's the pagan worldview, which is God is the world and all things in it. So God is fundamentally embodiment. And oftentimes, even in pagan faiths, you'll see that that there's an element of monism in it as well. That you'll see that in Hinduism, for example, there's also this idea of Brahma, which after you get beyond the sort of gods that have form, you also have this God without form, which is Brahma. All right, so I think we've thoroughly covered this idea of, are we all one, or are we all individuals, or is God cosmic and universal, or personal and unique?